Good evening and welcome to a little podcast about the CRT apology merry-go-round. The Church Commissioners has in 2023 found that monies it had in a previous account called the Queen Anne's Bounty that dates back to the year 1704 had links with transatlantic slavery. The Church of England is saying, well over 250 years plus later, that it is sorry about this situation. The Archbishop of Canterbury has gone on record saying he is deeply sorry about the African transatlantic slave trade. The Church of England wants to commit £100 million of Church Commissioner monies from 2023 onwards to a programme of impact investment, research, and different forms of engagement. And this amount of money, £100 million, has actually been pushed wider by some people to actually say that it's not even quite enough, and they're recommending that the £100 million is actually increased markedly above that. This whole, what I call the apology merry-go-round, it raises all sorts of questions. Now, I am recording this as somebody who is a committed Anglican. I go to an Anglican church. I am a Christian, but it raises all sorts of questions. Now, I'm not a member of the clergy. I am a member, as the Anglicans tend to call it, the Church of England calls it laity. But it raises some very fundamental questions about money and reparations. And the whole process could be seen to be quite flawed in its thinking. So I'm going to raise some questions. Please give me a like and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you wish. It would be great. We've got over 300 subscribers now. And it would be great for you to comment, like, and subscribe if you would kindly do so. So slavery, the whole issue of slavery was, and even is still in some nations, universal, even today. But in all nations, historically, it has been a universal phenomenon to a greater or lesser degree. There was a specific example of mainly Western European slavery. At school, we used to call it the transatlantic slave trade. It was evident in Europe in the 17th, 18th, and 19th, early 19th centuries in particular. And Britain was part of that slave trade. And let me be under no, let me ensure that I say quite clearly that that slave trade was barbaric, it was anti-human, and it was clearly wrong. There's no two ways of putting it. And there were reasons why Western European nations were, and I say it in inverted commas, successful at exporting large numbers of peoples from the West African nations or tribes over to new colonies in the New World, as it was then called. Slavery by Europe became an industry simply due to greed, colonial expansion, and technological ability by these Western European nations, particularly from the 1600s, the early 1600s, right through to the early 1800s, in particular, if we're looking at Britain. But how far did this narrow example of slavery represent all of Europe, and specifically how can present-day Europeans be held responsible? That's my first question. Do we believe in collective responsibility? So if something that my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did, can I be held, or should I be held responsible? And that's not just about slavery, that's about other things as well. Then Britain, via many, but one or two particular well-known evangelical Christian reformers, people like William Wilberforce, who is perhaps the prime example, he helped outlaw slavery in Britain and later across the whole of the British Empire. Men like John Newton are examples, if you like, of the human picture of slavery. He was the ex-slave trader captain who wrote the amazing hymn, sorry about the pun, but Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. He was convicted of his sin. He was convicted of his wrongdoing and repented and turned away from being a slave ship captain, as he then was, and he moved away from that and became a well-known evangelical of his day. The Royal Navy in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, formed the West Africa Squadron, and it was the biggest navy of the day. It actively suppressed the slave trade by what we call interdiction at sea of slaver vessels from many nations, not just Britain. There's also a wider question, and I haven't gone into it here in any great detail, but it's a question that I'm raising. What about black on black slavery in Africa amongst tribal nations? The slavery from Western Africa would not have been successful without the cooperation of powerful black tribal chieftains who ensured there was a steady stream for reward, financial and otherwise, trade and so on, to these Western European nations, so Holland, Portugal, Spain and Britain as some examples. The maritime nations, if you like, the chief maritime nations of Western Europe. But what about black on black slavery in Africa? What about Arab on black slavery in Africa? What about the Barbery slave trade that enslaved many hundreds of thousands, indeed, it's been estimated millions over the several hundred years that it existed? The Barbary slave traders were from North Africa, were generally Muslims who sailed across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. And in many cases, and not a lot of British people know this, but invaded Cornwall, the Cornish towns. They even set up a slave trade island. I think it was on Lundy Island for a while, and captured, kidnapped. Some were returned for the payment of a ransom. However, many were castrated. Many of the men were castrated and were sold into a barbaric, widespread North African and beyond slave trade. What about the, here's another question, what about the indentured servanthood of many, there were many Irish people, but also many English and Scottish indentured servants who were in practice slaves? One could argue that it wasn't as harsh as the transatlantic slave trade, which was harsh. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I'm not in any way underestimating the barbarity and the inhumanity of that slave trade. And here's a question which I think hasn't really been answered. Are we today in 2024 responsible for previous generations' misdemeanors? the Bible seems to point out that we are personally responsible for what we do. Now, it may be that our family has particularly benefited from wrongdoing, and there's no reason why we can't apologise for that if it's very specific, it's very tangible, and it may even be that a particular family wants to give reparations and give money back. I mean, I'm not in any way saying that that shouldn't be done, but for whole nations and for the Church of England specifically to take on this responsibility seems a somewhat illogical and actually, quite honestly, an unbiblical step. The Bible seems to point to personal responsibility of the individual rather than collective responsibility and collective guilt. We can repent of a specific family wrongdoing, we can even make amends, but to attach undue guilt to all white Europeans makes absolutely no sense. It's nonsense. Continued apologies by Church of England clergy are meaningless, and they just reinforce a form of victimhood and a racialized ideology. So the whole premise of the £100 million reparation or use of that £100 million seems really historically quite illogical. It seems theologically quite irrational and illogical. And thirdly, it goes against scriptural teaching about the nature of man, about the responsibility of man, and about nationhood as well. So, yes, I mean, I think just I would all I would say is go and think about these things. But Britain can be ashamed of parts of its past. I don't have any compunction about denying that. But it must make recognition of the great strides of Judeo-Christian thought and action by people like William Wilberforce, for example. William Wilberforce was, for most of his career in Parliament, tried to outlaw the slave trade. It took him scores of years, it took him decades to fight Parliament and the vested interest in the slave trade. And it's really quite crass of the Church of England today to not fully recognise individual responsibility and Britain's great and amazing example of standing up against institutional slavery and slavery that made millions of pounds on the blood, sweat and tears of slaves across the Atlantic. And William Wilberforce, at the time, there was a medal made and it said, a little copper coin, I think it was, and it said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And it's the picture of a slave kneeling down and just saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And William Wilberforce realized that the slave trade was barbaric, it was evil. And he proposed, along with thousands and thousands of other evangelical Christians, that all men and women are brothers and are made in God's image. All men and women are made in God's image. And then another thing I just want you to think about, this whole apologizing thing, apologizing for things we've not done, it devalues the apology itself. And it buys into this critical race theory ideology of oppressor and oppressed. And where we see certain races as oppressed and certain races as oppressors, it's a racialized history. And it's one that's, if you like, often based on a Marxist view of humankind, which is, I would argue, is flawed and anti-scriptural, is anti-Christian, actively anti-Christian. And critical race theory is really not something we should be building a firm foundation on. Surely we should be questioning the wrong actions of people in our historical past, no doubt about it, but in the light of a rounded, rational, and scriptural response, not a narrow, ineffective, historically inept manner, as the Church of England appears to have done. It seems to want to apologise for a very narrow interpretation of history, whilst not accepting that all nations everywhere at all times in history have pretty well practiced slavery. And I would point you to the work of Professor Nigel Bigar, who is from Oxford University, who has in great depth looked at the British Empire. And I think that when you look at it in the round, you will realise that this, as I have called it, this merry-go-round of Church of England Anglican apologising does us no good whatsoever. I would welcome your comments. I would welcome your views. And again, thank you for listening to me. Do like, do subscribe, do leave a comment. It would be great to hear from you. Thank you ever so much and have a great evening. Thank you.